Hello and welcome to Introduction to Diversity, Week 8. Today we're going to be studying Latin Americans. Okay, again, to understand anything in this class, we have to know a ton of stuff about history because to understand the experience of groups of people, we have to be able to track those groups of people over time. And, to really begin studying Latin Americans, we have to start out with Latin America was already populated. And if you go back farther enough, it turns out that people have been crossing the oceans long before Christopher Columbus. So for example, people have been going from Africa and then over to Latin America by boat for long periods of time. And we know this because of crop sharing, exchanges of different varieties. And then we also know this because of technology. Okay, so again, the idea that the world was globalized a long time ago, that did definitely occur. There's people on every single continent, and there always has been. So again, Latin America was already populated by a group of people. So Spain came over and took over the southern hemisphere. What's the politically correct way to say it? Latin America, South America, Hispaniola. I mean, what is the proper way to say the southern continent and still be politically correct? So again, this is one of the things we're going to be thinking about. So again, the Spanish, though, come over and 95% of the indigenous people were killed through guns and germs. Okay, so essentially you only had a 5% of the people that were actually left that survived the actual conquest. And then that 5% then generally became indentured servants, okay, not so much slaves. So Latin America, again, was conquered by Spain, some of the islands by England and the Dutch and the French, so it's got a lot of blend going on in Latin America. And then, so you had the indigenous people already there. You had people coming from Spain and England and the Dutch and the French and the Portuguese, taking in Brazil. And so then those people are then blending with the Africans that are also brought over there to work in the sugar plantations and things like that. So already you can see that Latin America has an incredibly diverse blend of ethnicity. And you can see that in the languages, you can see that in the culture, and you can see how you have little bits of all these different countries and all these different people coming together. So in the United States, it wasn't that difficult to segregate between European and non-European because, it was an English conquered country and most people from England already had the lighter colored skin. So when we divided American races into light skinned, white, and not lighter skinned, non-white, it was very kind of more clear cut. It was easier to see. But in Latin America, because you have this blend, they have something called the color gradient. Like in Latin America, you don't have a clear-cut racial system because it's not as easy to be able to distinguish between different people because it's so incredibly blended. I mean, again, the Spanish and the Portuguese, how far is that from Africa to begin with? So they're already blended, and then you just have all these other different people coming together and blending in Latin America. Certainly, you just have this incredible genetic diversity, essentially. So because of the very extensive genetic diversity, what you're finding is they couldn't do something like a clear-cut white, non-white racial categories. They needed a color gradient. So in Latin America, it became all about how light you were. Of course, Latin America was dominated by the Europeans, by Spain, and then the American-born European descendants overthrew Spain in the Latin American Wars of Independence, and the European descendants who had light skin in Latin America then took over the 1%, the elite social positions of Latin America, and then maintained their privilege and power by, maintaining their roots to that European ancestry. And so the idea of power in Latin America was all based upon how light your skin was. And then, of course, whether you were a landowner, the owning class, the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat, okay? So power in Latin America became about being a bougie, to say it slang, right? And then also to have light-colored skin. And so you see that with the kings and the conquerors and all the Latin American presidents, they're always trying to whiten themselves. Okay, so you hear this idea of the color gradient and whitening yourself, okay? Because to whiten yourself in Latin America, to lighten yourself, enables you to get better access to opportunities, goods, education, wealth, power, privilege, etc. Okay, so when we look at Latin America, again, as we learn with being white, it's just a grouping of a bunch of different people from a bunch of different places, okay? And so, when you think about what is North American versus Latin American, again, it's also very diverse, but we have more clear-cut racial categories in the North than we do in the South, okay? So again, whiteness is not a race. White is a pan-ethnicity. Okay, it's an idea of people from Russia and Europe and America, North America, wherever, all coming together, somehow get blended into some racial category called white, even though it just stretches the entire globe. I mean, it makes no sense. I mean, are Jewish people white or are they Jewish? Just again, but yet Jewish people get to check the white box, but so does anybody from the Middle East, and so does anybody from North Africa. They also get to check the white box. So being white means being from Middle East, North Africa, Europe, Russia, apparently. It's very confusing. So Latin America has the color gradient. It's all about how light you are determines your access, okay? So when you look at conflict theory and inequality, again, how has this ideology of whiteness been ingrained into people's minds? And then how is that associated with social class, relating to how much power you have over your own life and where you're located in the stratified hierarchical social system compared to other people, okay? So yeah, does it influence whether or not you're going to get a job if you're Muslim or if you're African, and again, that's institutional discrimination and bias, and that's what we're trying to expose in sociology, okay? So Latin Americans are a pan-ethnicity. They are not a race. It is just an incredible blend of genetic diversity, and there's a bunch of different countries, and people from Latin America most likely prefer to be called Mexican, for example, over Hispanic. And if you guys look at the word Hispanic and study the word Hispanic, you're going to find that it's a brand new word. Okay, it comes about like in the 1960s when people from South America or Latin America, different countries, wanted to come together to get some political power in America. So they came up with this word Hispanic, and then we grouped a bunch of people in there, but that did enable minorities, Hispanics, Latin Americans, Mexicans, Ecuadorians, Venezuelans to come together as a group, Cubans, Puerto Ricans, and fight together, and therefore, fight against inequality imposed upon them by white America, white male America. All right. So in the United States, the U.S. is 1/8 Latin American. Okay, again, what do we call it? Hispanic, Latino, Spanish American, all of these different words have been used. Should it be Mexican? Should it be so that would be a really good study to go find out what people actually want to be called in modern times, okay? Historically, people from Latin America, when they migrated to the United States, immigrated here, they came to urban areas, okay? And again, this idea of pan-ethnicity is solidarity between ethnic groups, which means a bunch of groups came together and they decided that we are a group, okay? And then they therefore gain political power and some power over their lives. Okay, and then F class, that's the idea of the intersection between social class and ethnicity, and that's what I was just talking about. Okay, how light you are determines which social class you're in, which country of origin you're from, your religion, your sex. These are all factors in where you're located in the social class system. How much power do you have over your life? The math equation, education plus job prestige plus wealth plus power, and then plus where you are in the racial grouping and where you are in the sex grouping and where you are in the religious grouping. Because if you're not in the position of privilege and power in the sex category or the race category, again, so it's all these intersecting variables determine your ability to have power over your own life, your access to healthcare, to education, right? So in Hispanic families, 60% speak Spanish at home. 1/3 of them speak Spanish at work, okay? There are very different forms of Spanish, okay? And then you also have the influence of Portuguese and Creole and French and English, all blended in with the native languages also. Bilingual education is a new concept that you're starting to see, but that is also a way to bring up minority groups to make sure they get access to education, because if they struggle with English, again, if you look into some of the aspects of speaking two languages and all those variables, which is more of an interesting psychological conversation, how does that affect the brain and how does it affect word recall? And someone who speaks two languages, does it take them an extra second? And then how does it cause different brain growth, things like that. So teaching in Spanish, for example, or teaching in native languages, Native American languages from last semester, or last chapter, again, that's the same exact thing. Okay, it's the idea of how do we reach these kids, and if we need to reach them in their native language, then so be it. However, remember the critiques of Ebonics when they started imposing Ebonics into the 1980s classrooms and the problems associated with that. So again, there's a back and forth kind of going on that's been going on for decades on this, okay? But English immersion is standard, again, in the United States because of social norms that are imposed upon people. And we all know the stereotypes about somebody walking in and saying, now that you're in this country, you're supposed to speak this language, right? I mean, again, but all Americans are immigrants at some point. We all had to learn it, except for the people that were actually from England. And not everyone in the United States or Latin America is from England, okay? So in modern times, the U.S. is starting to embrace this multilingual society. So we are embracing other cultures, and I think stereotypes are going down. But again, you still have some of these stereotypes against, as we studied in immigration, that chapter. So the stereotypes still exist, okay? So again, we talked about the political presence. Again, people with the same language coming together under the same racial category of Hispanic, which is, again, a made-up word. It's just a pan-ethnic grouping of a bunch of people. It's not a biological race that makes any sense, okay? You do see disparities in education rates for, again, 35% of people in America get bachelor's degrees, but only 10.6% of Hispanics. You got to ask why. Why is unemployment rate higher for Hispanics? Why are single parent households higher for Hispanics? Why are the income level disparities compared to whites? Why do those exist? Again, so in the United States, a Latin American woman makes less money than any other group in America. They make less money than a black woman. They make less money than a white woman, for example. Why? Is it culture, or is it because the structure of America that keeps people in the lower class based upon your race/pen ethnicity? Okay. Along the borderlands such as Texas, again, you've had this blending of these cultures for years because, again, essentially that used to be part of Mexico, which then used to be native land that used to be owned by Spain, okay, and then the natives before that, and then the Aztecs and the Incas, and okay, so just the farther you go back, you're like, who really owns this land, right? But now it's the U.S. and now it's called Texas, okay? But you do have that common culture of Latin America and United States blending in Texas. You see that in Florida, you see it in New York, you see it in California, you see it in Chicago, you see it everywhere, really. Cuban Americans, again, we had a migration of Cuban Americans at some point. Again, we've always had this, hit and miss with the population of Cuba. Hopefully that has improved over time. We almost were successful at that, and we'll see how it goes in the future regarding Cuba. I know they've kind of cut back on that restrictions under the new president that we have now. So there's not as many in the U.S., but again, this Cuban culture is very expressive and has made major influences on us. And sometimes a lot of people have left Cuba and come here, and you've had these times where it pops in the news with like Elian Gonzalez and people coming over in RAS. And a lot of that's very sad stories because a lot of people have died trying to come over, for example, from Cuba. But when they do come here, they tend to really assimilate very well in the United States and do very well. And so again, but we have these kind of prejudicial policies toward people from Cuba, which is why they have to occasionally just kind of flee the communism, and they've had to try to come here for a better life. And then that often ends up the problem because some storm will come and they get knocked off in a raft, for example. It's all very sad. But when you study migration patterns, oh my God, if you study the patterns of people coming from like Africa into Latin America and then traveling through the jungles of Latin America and trying to make their way across the border in America, they have literally traveled from Africa to Latin America just to try to get in the United States. And so many people die along the way. So again, you got to ask questions. Why would somebody even take that kind of a trip? What is it about the United States that's bringing them here? And then why are we so prejudicial toward them when they come? Okay, again, Central and South America, Latin America, whatever, I don't know what to call it. I'm always playing with words because I don't know what people prefer anymore. It's so confusing, right? It's an incredibly diverse place. Again, it's all about the color gradient. Going from light to dark determines your power. Again, this is just another reminder of the social construction of race, because in Latin America, you have races we don't have here, like mulatto and mestizo. Mulatto, African mixed with European, mestizo, Native American mixed with European, Creole, native born Europeans, but they weren't born in Europe, okay, so you have all these races you've never heard of because you're not in Latin America. That's what got me into race. I heard the word mestizo and then I looked it up. And I was like, mestizo, landowning people from from Europe, but they were born here, so they didn't have as much power. And then it was the mestizos, the Creoles, who overthrew the Spanish. So who overthrew the Spanish? Light-skinned European descendants that were born in the United States that didn't want European oppressors over them. All right, so really interesting stuff, okay? So mestizo, Hondurans, mulatto, African Panamanians, these are all races along the color gradient. And that's confusing, but look up some of those words and then you'll start to see race is Pandora's box of social construction, things that we have made up and continuously made up to account for diversity. Immigrants, again, have tried to flee here. They try to get out of poverty. They're overcoming oppression. They're trying to find a better life. And then when they come to America, how do we respond to them? Again, we need to bring in people to grow our economy. So why do we have negative attitudes toward people coming here? Okay, Mexican Americans, there's always been a continuous large-scale movement into the United States. Again, that used to be part of Mexico. You have to think like that was part of their way of life, was being there, okay? We still have strong cultural ties to Mexico. We do have some mutual distrust, but obviously we're constantly working together, Mexico, United States, and Canada, because in the end, we're all very close to each other, and so we bond together. Mexico does have a culture of poverty. Again, it's because light-skinned people owned all the land, and so when you have this 1% dominating the entire economy and the social system, that's why people are coming here. People don't want to just leave their homes. They have to come here because of the oppression and their inability to get access in their own country, okay? Right? All right. So you have had some of these movements, like this Chavez farm laborers movement. You had, Hispanics coming together into as one group. You had the National Farm Workers Associated, the United Farm Workers. So you've had these different groups that have come together and sought political power. But that was because they need to then overcome even more oppression in the United States, on top of the oppression they experience often in Latin America. Okay. Puerto Ricans, again, we took this over from Spain. It is still a colony of the United States. They are citizens of the U.S. and can come to the mainland anytime. Again, Puerto Ricans is very mixed. It was a Spanish slave colony, okay? So you had people from all over, African, Native, European, all blending into one, okay? So neocolonialism is this continued dependence on foreign power, but they want a national identity. That's how Puerto Rico is. Like, left on their own, do they need the infrastructure? Like, look what's happening when they get hit with a hurricane. But is the United States actually jumping in and really helping Puerto Rico when they get hit with a hurricane? So again, you have this back and forth between oppressor and oppressed. Okay, they have fought for independence from the United States, but they have never won. Okay, they do have a better economy, again, because of the association with the United States, but compared to other states in the United States, for example, it is below the bell curve, okay? So again, we apply the world systems theory, again, is that, these powers, these European powers that once dominated society still continue to do it. We still have these privileged positions in a global spectrum of the world, okay? So again, how was the Latino community united in the United States? That's something that we have on our discussion board that's very interesting and I'd like to talk about, How do these people from different countries, different ethnicities somehow come together and now they're all known as Hispanics? Where does that word come from? Study the origin of the word, okay? How do Hispanics view themselves as a group? Again, do they want to be called Mexicans? Because everybody that I've ever worked with that's from Mexico prefers to be called Mexican, not Hispanic. So again, that's from going out and studying people's subjective experiences on these topics, for example. Okay, so thank you so much. It's an honor talking to you. If you have any questions, please email me. Thank you again for listening.